Imagine a country where almost half the parliament is female,
Right.
like nearly double the global average.
Yeah.
And if you just saw that one single statistic in a vacuum, you would probably assume you were looking at a nation with a booming economy, endless institutional resources, maybe a massive surplus of wealth.
Oh, absolutely. You'd assume that kind of advanced political representation is, the capstone on a perfectly built, highly developed society.
Exactly. And you would be completely wrong. Welcome to the Mozambique paradox.
It really forces a complete reassessment of how we map human progress.
Yeah.
Because we are so conditioned to view development as this linear chronological ladder. First a nation secures basic survival, then it builds an industrial base, it generates wealth, and only after all of that is secured do we expect to see significant strides in complex social equity, like gender parity and high governance.
Right, which is why the data we are examining in this deep dive is just so compelling. We are unpacking a comprehensive academic presentation that tracks Mozambique's multidimensional human development from 1990 all the way to 2023.
33 years of data.
Yeah, decades of raw data, covering the Human Development Index, the Gender Inequality Index, environmental footprints, the works, and the central mystery we're trying to solve with you today is what happens when a country's political empowerment radically outpaces its baseline economic survival.
What's fascinating here is how stark the contrast is. As of the 2023 data, women hold 43.2% of the parliamentary seats in Mozambique.
Wow.
And the world average is hovering around 26.5%. So we are looking at a level of political inclusion that is roughly 1.6 times the global standard.
That's huge.
It is. It surpasses many of the wealthiest, most industrialized nations on Earth.
But then, you look at the wider context and the cognitive dissonance really hits you. Because in that exact same year, 2023, Mozambique ranked 182nd out of 193 countries globally on the Human Development Index.
Right at the bottom.
Firmly situated in the lowest tier of human development. So we are talking about a nation wrestling with profound systemic poverty and a severe lack of basic economic infrastructure.
And that is the core asymmetry we need to explore today. Because how does a society operating with such intense resource scarcity engineer a political environment where women have that much of a voice at the highest levels of national governance?
Right.
And more importantly, the presentation raises the critical follow-up question. Why hasn't that high-level political representation cascaded down into comprehensive poverty reduction for the rest of the population?
Okay, let's unpack this, because I am stuck on that exact disconnect. If almost half the lawmakers are women, theoretically representing the most vulnerable demographics, why is the broader population still trapped in this low development tier?
Yeah.
It feels like it's like we are looking at a structurally fragile building that somehow boasts the most advanced state-of-the-art solar roof ever designed.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. The roof is a marvel of modern engineering, but the foundation it rests on is lagging decades behind.
Well, to understand why the roof isn't supporting the building, we have to stop looking at the parliament and start looking at the dirt the foundation is poured into.
Okay.
The academic presentation we're analyzing, it insists that we cannot understand Mozambique's 2023 paradox without tracing the baseline trajectory of its development over the last 33 years. The context of their starting point is everything.
Let's dig into that historical longitudinal data then, because the numbers from 1990 are, frankly, sobering. Mozambique's Human Development Index, or HDI, was a staggering 0.246.
Extremely low.
Yeah, but fast forward to 2023, and that score has surged to 0.493.
Which is a 100.4% growth rate. They effectively doubled their national human development score.
Doubled it.
Yeah. And to put that in perspective, during that exact same 33-year window, the world average HDI moved from 0.608 to 0.756.
Okay, so the global baseline moved forward, certainly.
Right, but Mozambique's relative growth rate was explosive by comparison.
Doubling a national development index is a monumental undertaking. But let's step away from the abstract index scores for a second and look at the human metrics that actually feed into that math.
Let's do it.
So life expectancy in Mozambique jumped from 44.3 years in 1990 to 63.6 years in 2023. That is an addition of almost 20 years, 19.3 years to the average life.
It's massive.
And mean years of schooling increased by 187%, moving from a meager 1.6 years to 4.6 years.
What's fascinating here is that the timing of these jumps tells a very specific story about state building. The presentation divides this progress into two distinct historical phases.
Okay.
So from 1990 to roughly the year 2000, the data practically flatlines. There is minimal growth.
Why is that?
Well, this was the immediate aftermath of a brutal, protracted civil war. That entire decade was dedicated simply to stopping the bleeding, literal and figurative. It was about stabilizing regions, clearing landmines, establishing just the most basic functions of a state.
Right. That makes total sense. I mean, you can't build schools when you are still trying to secure the borders and feed displaced populations.
Exactly. But then we look at the period from 2000 to 2015, and the data spikes dramatically. This is the explosive growth phase where the bulk of that HDI doubling actually occurs.
Wow.
It represents a pivot from post-conflict stabilization to aggressive institutional rebuilding.
Think about the societal implications of that for a second. Adding nearly 20 years to a country's life expectancy in a single generation. I want you, the listener, to imagine that. We are not just talking about lines on a graph.
No, not at all.
We are talking about an entire society going from an average lifespan where people rarely see their 45th birthday to routinely living into their mid-60s. That fundamentally alters the fabric of a community.
It really does. You suddenly have a generation of grandparents who are alive to pass down agricultural knowledge, oral histories, provide childcare. It completely stabilizes the family unit. It is a profound triumph of public health and resilience, and moving the needle on mean schooling from 1.6 to 4.6 years. I know it might sound small to someone in the global north.
Right, under 5 years of school.
Yeah, but sociologically, that is the leap from widespread absolute illiteracy to basic functional literacy and numeracy. It completely changes how a population interacts with information, with contracts, with medicine.
I don't want to diminish that achievement because it is incredible. But the presentation also makes it really clear that we can't just celebrate the doubling of the HDI and call it a day.
Sure.
Because the HDI is an aggregate score, right? It averages out several different metrics. And when the researchers deconstruct that 2023 score of 0.493 into its individual pillars, a massive vulnerability is exposed.
Yeah, the HDI rests on three pillars. You've got health, education, and standard of living, which is measured by income.
Okay.
And if we look at how Mozambique compares to the world averages in 2023, the disparity is very wildly depending on the pillar.
So on health, their life expectancy is 63.6 years against the world average of 73.4. And for education, their expected years of schooling is 10.8 compared to the global 13.0.
Right. So those two pillars, health and education, they are undeniably lagging behind the global average, but they are relatively within sight of it.
Yeah, they're catching up.
They have closed the gap significantly. The state has managed to build a functioning infrastructure for basic physical survival and elementary learning.
But then the third pillar was where the math just falls off a cliff. Standard of living, which is measured by gross national income per capita, the world average is $20,327. Mozambique's is $1,356.
It's staggering. That is the defining structural weakness. Mozambique's income level is just 6.6% of the world average. It represents an entirely different universe of economic reality.
Okay, let's visualize this. Think of human development as a massive, complex vehicle trying to cross a continent.
Okay, I like this.
Education is the engine, right? The size and efficiency of the engine dictate how much horsepower you have, how fast you can adapt and move. Health is the chassis and the tires. It determines if the vehicle can actually survive the brutal terrain of the journey without breaking apart.
Right.
So Mozambique has spent the last 30 years painstakingly building a functioning engine and a sturdy chassis out of pure grit and international aid.
But the gross national income, that is the fuel.
Exactly. And at 6.6% of the global average, there is practically zero fuel in the tank. You can have students sitting in classrooms longer and citizens surviving preventable diseases, but without economic liquidity, without capital circulating through the base of the society, that potential energy never converts into kinetic energy.
The vehicle is built, but it is stalled in the dirt.
Exactly.
And this forces us back to the primary paradox of the data. When resources are this incredibly scarce, when the economic fuel is measured in drops, how is the society distributing what little they have between men and women?
Right, back to the parliament statistic.
Yeah. We know women hold 43% of the parliament, but how does the baseline population actually fare?
This is where we look at the Gender Development Index, the GDI. And again, the numbers totally challenge our assumptions. Mozambique's GDI is 0.920, the world average is 0.955. The UN places Mozambique in GDI Group 4, which indicates medium to high equality in HDI achievements between women and men.
The data reveals a really unexpected balance. Despite operating in extreme multidimensional poverty, the disparity between men's and women's health and education in Mozambique is surprisingly minimal.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, if you look closely at the data tables, their life expectancy and expected schooling gaps between genders are smaller than in several high-income nations.
I honestly struggle to process that. With a per capita income hovering around $1,000 a year, how does a society maintain that kind of parity?
Well, it is an enforced parity of deprivation. Yeah. When communities are fighting day to day for absolute basic survival, the lack of resources is shared relatively equally across the household. There simply isn't enough surplus wealth for one gender to wildly outpace the other in basic consumption.
Wow, that paints a pretty grim picture of equality.
Ugh.
And the labor statistics in the presentation compound this. The female labor force participation rate in Mozambique is 76.6%. The global average is just 46.5%.
That is an astonishing rate of labor participation for women.
But wait, let's play out the logic here. If nearly 77% of women are actively participating in the labor force, and there is relative gender parity in basic health and schooling,
Right.
and they have massive political representation in parliament,
Yeah.
why isn't this translating into economic fuel? Why isn't a massive, mobilized female workforce generating wealth?
Because we have to interrogate the definition of labor in this context. The presentation stresses that we cannot project Western economic models onto these statistics. This 76.6% participation rate does not represent formalized, high-wage corporate labor. We are not talking about women entering the tech sector or formalized manufacturing or climbing the corporate ladder.
So what does the labor actually look like on the ground?
It is survival labor. It's subsistence agriculture. It is participating in the highly volatile informal economy, selling basic goods in local, unregulated markets.
Right.
These women are working incredibly long, physically demanding hours because they have absolutely no other choice if they want to keep their families fed. There is no social safety net.
So high labor participation in this specific data set isn't a signal of a booming, inclusive economy. It's a distress signal. It is a metric of economic desperation.
Exactly. It serves as a testament to immense societal resilience. These women are quite literally the backbone holding the daily economy of the country together.
Yeah.
But the data highlights a severe tearing gap between basic survival and actual wealth-generating empowerment. A woman can work 14 hours a day in an agricultural field, effectively keeping her family alive, but she remains entirely trapped in multidimensional poverty.
Because she's not generating taxable wealth.
Right, she has no pension, and she is incredibly vulnerable to climate shocks.
This brings us to a critical juncture in the source material. If women are working this hard, if they have this much political representation, what is the specific mechanism anchoring them down? What is stopping this massive labor force from formalizing, from building generational wealth, and from moving out of the informal sector?
The researchers point us toward the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, to find that anchor. The GII measures reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. And it is within the reproductive health data that we find a massive systemic bottleneck.
Looking at the GII data, there is a complex narrative of, victory and ongoing crisis. First, the victory. Mozambique achieved a phenomenal reduction in maternal mortality. In 1990, the rate was 927.5 deaths per 100,000 live births.
It was incredibly dangerous to give birth.
Right. But by 2023, they managed to drive that number down to 127.1.
That is a public health miracle in a low-income setting. It requires targeted international aid, the training of thousands of community health workers, establishing basic sanitary protocols in rural areas. I mean, hundreds of thousands of mothers survive to raise their children because of that drop.
But the researchers immediately contrast that victory with the second reproductive health metric, the adolescent birth rate. And this number is just devastating. In Mozambique, the adolescent birth rate is 153.5 births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19.
And to contextualize how severe that is, the global average is 39.1. So Mozambique's rate is 3.9 times higher than the rest of the world.
We're talking about girls who are 15, 16, 17 years old having children at an industrial scale. I have to ask, if the state managed to mobilize the resources to drastically lower maternal mortality, why couldn't they use those same health networks to address early pregnancy?
Because treating a medical complication during childbirth is fundamentally different from dismantling deeply entrenched cultural norms around early marriage and female domestic roles.
Ah, I see.
Preventing maternal mortality requires a sterile clinic and a trained midwife. Preventing an adolescent birth requires keeping a young girl in school, providing comprehensive sex education, ensuring access to contraceptives in rural areas,
That's a lot more complicated.
and shifting the economic calculus of a family that might view marrying off a daughter as a financial necessity. It is a much heavier lift.
And the presentation argues that this specific metric, the adolescent birth rate, is the anchor holding back the economic fuel. How does the math work there?
Well, it acts as an absolute barrier to formal economic entry. When a 15-year-old girl has a child, her expected years of schooling almost always terminate immediately. The societal infrastructure just does not exist to support a teenage mother staying in a classroom.
So she gets permanently locked out of the engine of education we talked about earlier.
Precisely. And because she is locked out of education, she is immediately forced into that informal, unregulated survival labor market to feed her child. She cannot acquire the specialized skills required to enter the formalized higher wage economy.
Right.
She is working to survive, not to build capital. And tragically, because her own education was truncated, statistics show her children are significantly more likely to repeat the exact same cycle. It locks the society into the intergenerational transmission of poverty.
Think about the implications of that on human potential.
Yeah.
I mean, consider how radically different your life trajectory, your career options, and your financial security would be if all of your major life choices, your educational ceiling, and your earning potential were permanently locked in by the time you were 15 years old.
It is a staggering loss of national brain trust.
It is. And this vulnerability of young women feeds directly into a much broader systemic issue that the presentation argues is actively bleeding out Mozambique's development progress.
Right.
We have to examine the architecture of their extreme inequality.
The researchers employ a fascinating model to quantify this bleeding effect. They use the inequality-adjusted HDI, the IHDI.
Okay, what does that do?
This metric takes the baseline human development score and actively discounts it based on how unequally the achievements in health, education, and income are distributed across the general population.
And the drop is severe. We established Mozambique's baseline HDI is 0.493. When adjusted for inequality, that score plummets to an IHDI of 0.297.
That is an overall loss of 39.8% of their entire development potential,
Almost 40%.
just erased by inequality. The world average loss due to inequality is 22.0%. Mozambique is losing nearly double the global average.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's visualize how this works mechanically. Imagine pouring water into a complex national irrigation system, right? Designed to water a vast field representing the country's population. But because of severe structural inequality, 40% of the water flowing through the pipes is deliberately routed to just one single, highly protected farm at the top of the hill.
Oh, wow.
Meanwhile, the millions of crops down in the valley receive nothing but an intermittent trickle. The water exists, the progress exists, but it never reaches the average citizen.
And the data allows us to see exactly where the pipes are routed. The researchers broke down that 39.8% loss to see which pillars are the most unequal.
Okay.
Inequality in life expectancy accounts for 27.3% of the loss. Inequality in education accounts for 34.3%.
But the single most destructive force, income inequality, it accounts for a massive 54.4% of the development loss.
Over half of the human development loss to inequality is strictly due to wealth hoarding and income disparity.
This finally explains the paradox we started with. Why doesn't 43% female political representation solve the poverty issue? Because it's not just that the national fuel tank is empty. It's that the tiny, microscopic amount of economic fuel they do have is being fiercely guarded by a fraction of the population.
Yeah.
The structural economic divide is so deep, so deeply entrenched in the system, that sheer political will in the parliament cannot bridge it without a massive systemic redistribution of wealth and opportunity.
And this grim reality is further cemented by the researchers when they introduce the multidimensional poverty index, the MPI.
The MPI is vital because it moves beyond the assumption that poverty is just a lack of cash.
Exactly. The MPI proves that poverty is a web of overlapping, interconnected deprivations. It measures whether a household lacks a fundamental triad of needs: decent living standards, basic education, and health.
And the findings from Mozambique are sobering. 60.7% of the population lives in multidimensional poverty.
Over 6 in 10 people. And the researchers break down the contributions to that poverty. Lack of education contributes 33.2%, and lack of health contributes 17.3%.
It illustrates how sticky the poverty trap is. It's not just that a family lacks income. It's that they lack income, and they don't have access to a nearby clean water source. And the local school lacks trained teachers. And there is no all-weather road to transport their agricultural goods to a larger market.
Right, these deprivations reinforce each other.
Exactly.
If you are poor in health, you cannot work efficiently, which keeps you poor in income, which means you cannot afford schooling for your children, which keeps the next generation poor in health.
It is a localized cycle of extreme deprivation. But here is where the academic presentation takes a highly unexpected turn. Up until this point, we have been viewing Mozambique's development entirely through its own internal struggles.
Yes.
But the researchers force us to pull back and view this exact same data through a global ecological lens. And when they do that, the entire narrative flips, presenting a really complex ethical dilemma.
They introduced the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI. This index takes a country's human development score and applies a penalty based on the burden that country places on the planet.
That's right.
Specifically tracking their per capita carbon emissions and their material footprint.
When you apply this ecological penalty globally, the world's overall HDI drops by a significant 10%, falling from 0.756 to 0.680. The highly developed wealthy nations are heavily penalized in this metric because their high standard of living is inherently tied to massive environmental destruction and resource extraction.
But when you apply that exact same planetary pressure penalty to Mozambique, their index only drops by 1.4%. It moves from 0.493 to 0.486.
It barely registers a change. In fact, when adjusted for planetary pressures, Mozambique actually moves up 3 spots in the global rankings.
The absolute numbers explain why. Mozambique's per capita carbon emissions are 0.237 tons. The global average is 4.536 tons.
The world average is 19 times higher. Just let that sink in for a moment.
The material footprint tells the exact same story. Mozambique extracts and consumes 2.273 tons of material per capita. The world average is a staggering 12.714 tons.
Wow.
So by every single ecological metric available, Mozambique possesses an incredibly green footprint.
But the researchers make a crucial, necessary distinction here. This incredibly green footprint is not the result of a conscious, progressive environmental policy.
Wow.
The citizens of Mozambique are not driving electric vehicles and utilizing smart grids. This low footprint is the passive, enforced result of extreme poverty and a total lack of heavy industrialization. They are not emitting carbon because they literally lack the economic fuel to burn.
And this specific dynamic forms the foundation of the presentation's conclusion regarding international climate justice.
And to be clear, we are neutrally exploring the argument made in this academic presentation. We are mapping out the researcher's thesis on international climate policy. We aren't taking a political stance on global resource redistribution.
Of course.
But the argument presented is incredibly thought-provoking.
The thesis argues that in a framework of global ecological balance, countries like Mozambique find themselves in an impossible position. They are carrying almost zero of the planetary burden. They are contributing virtually nothing to global warming, yet they are suffering the most from a lack of human development.
Furthermore, geographically, they are often the ones suffering the most catastrophic, immediate impacts of climate change caused by the emissions of the global north.
We saw that with the devastating cyclones that have hit Mozambique in recent years, wiping out massive portions of their agricultural GDP overnight. The researchers argue strongly that because of this imbalance, Mozambique should be viewed as a priority beneficiary for international climate compensation.
The central idea is the subsidization of green leapfrog technologies. Historically, the only way a low-income nation catches up economically is through dirty industrialization, burning cheap fossil fuels to build infrastructure.
Sure.
The researchers argue that wealthy nations should provide the capital and technology for Mozambique to build a formalized green economy from scratch. The goal is to allow them to leapfrog the dirty industrial phase entirely, ensuring they can raise their human development without destroying their uniquely green footprint. It asks a heavy question of the international community. Is it fair that the nations living closest to absolute zero emissions are the ones paralyzed by multidimensional poverty?
Yeah.
If high human development inherently requires destroying the planet, as the global averages suggest, then perhaps our traditional definition of development is fundamentally broken.
The Mozambique data forces the global north to interrogate its own developmental blueprints.
So what does this all mean?
Right.
We have layered on an incredible amount of data. We started with a parliament where 43% of the seats are held by women. We looked at a massive 77% female labor force that is trapped in survival agriculture.
Right.
We examined how adolescent birth rates lock girls out of education, how structural inequality reroutes 40% of the nation's progress to the elite, and how their carbon footprint is practically a rounding error on the global scale. How do the researchers synthesize all of this into a roadmap?
The presentation synthesizes the data by identifying 4 specific, massive gears that are actively constraining Mozambique's development. 4 bottlenecks that must be dismantled if the country is to translate its political empowerment into economic reality.
Okay, the first gear is extreme inequality. That 39.8% loss of potential development must be plugged. The wealth cannot remain concentrated at the absolute top of the irrigation system. There must be mechanisms for inclusive economic distribution.
The second gear is reproductive health risks. The adolescent birth rate is recognized as a crisis of human capital. Until young women are structurally supported to delay childbirth, they cannot remain in the education engine, and that informal labor trap will persist for generations.
The third gear is education quality deficits. We discussed earlier how the mean years of schooling increased drastically. But the multidimensional poverty index showed that a lack of education still contributes heavily to the poverty web. This suggests a severe quality deficit. Just putting a child in a room for 4 years isn't enough. The qualities of learning, the specific skills being taught must be relevant and translatable to economic value in the real world.
And the fourth gear is the fragile economic base, the tiny gross national income per capita. The vehicle simply needs more fuel.
Right.
The society requires the creation of formalized, wealth-generating jobs, transitioning the labor force out of pure survival agriculture and into sectors that offer stability, taxable income, and resilience against climate shocks.
If we look at the core thesis binding all this data together, Mozambique serves as a vital proof of concept for the global community. They have definitively proven that high political participation and gender balance can exist in incredibly low-income conditions. They shatter the assumption that political empowerment is a luxury reserved for wealthy nations.
However, the data also proves that political representation alone is insufficient. Extreme structural inequality acts as an impenetrable barrier, preventing that advanced political empowerment from becoming a daily economic reality for the average citizen.
Closing the gap at the bottom of the society is vastly more vital than simply raising the ceiling at the top. You can't just build a highly advanced, equitable roof. You have to pour concrete into the foundation.
The political will to change is clearly present in the system. The societal resilience, evidenced by the labor force and the survival through post-conflict rebuilding, is undeniable.
Yeah.
But the systemic inequities, both domestic wealth hoarding and the global climate imbalances, are acting as a chokehold on their potential.
It is a remarkable story. I want to thank you for helping decode this incredible academic presentation today. It is a powerful reminder of how raw numbers, when properly contextualized, can tell a profoundly human story. It's a narrative of paradoxes, of immense struggle, and of the complex fight for basic equity in a fractured world.
It is always a privilege to explore the mechanisms behind the metrics. And I'd like to leave you, listening right now, with a final thought to ponder as we close out this analysis. We spend so much time measuring human progress by our highest technological achievements, our soaring GDPs, or our most comfortable, hyper-consuming societies.
Right.
But if a nation like Mozambique can achieve near parity in political representation while surviving on a mere fraction of the global average income, what does that say about the excuses wealthy nations make for their own lingering social inequities? Are we measuring the true height of human development by looking only at our highest peaks? Or should we be measuring the maturity of a society by how urgently it bridges its deepest divides?
That is the question to sit with. Take a hard look at the blueprints of your own society. Where is the water flowing, and where are the gaps? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the data around you, look for the human stories hidden inside the spreadsheets, and we will catch you next time.